So the more I think about it, the more I realize that the way I think about Jesus, the way I understand his story, even the way I read his words is probably mostly shaped by my upbringing, my values, and my context. And so when I think about our church at large, I'm asking, well, what's our context? What do we value? And for us in America, well, we are transactional people. We run towards reward. We run away from punishment. We promote innocence. We demonize guilt, right? And we value individualism, right? We've built laws and systems that protect our personal liberties. And so when I hear the story of Jesus in our context, it's a story that reflects those things. It's a story where Jesus comes and pays for my personal sins. He becomes guilty so that I can feel innocent. He takes on punishment so I can receive a reward. And while there are treasures here, I have to ask, is this the only way of looking at the Jesus story? Is this the only lens that I can see Jesus through? Are America's values identical to the values of heaven? Is there something more? And see, the earliest followers of Jesus asked these questions and they realized that there was something more, that maybe Jesus's death wasn't just about a substitution, but also about victory. That maybe Jesus isn't just wanting to come into our hearts, but he's inviting the whole world to enter into his. That Jesus didn't just come to die, but he became like us so that we could live like him. Right? And so if I view the world through this lens, I start to realize that Jesus's life is just as important as his death. The way that he lived, the people he interacted with, his everyday small, detailed interactions are just as much the gospel as the cross and the empty tomb. And so with that thought, we enter Jesus the day that he rose from the dead. And the overarching sense that we get is that nothing is the same. Nothing can be the same. And we enter into a story of two people on the road to Emmaus, the day Jesus rose from the dead. You could read about this in Luke 24. And these people were with Jesus. They saw all the things that he did. And from their context and culture and values, they created a belief system around what Jesus should do. They created a story for how the Jesus story should end. Well, Jesus died. And the story that they created, their expectations, that died with him. And so their first response, their natural response, their only response is to go home, to return to what's familiar. Well, check this out. Jesus walks alongside of them. He teaches them, he's talking to them. And because they were so set on what was familiar, because they were so focused on the story that they had created, they ended up missing Jesus. And it's not until they sat down and have a meal that they recognize who he is and they start to change their old ways of thinking. Well, the reality is this moment has forced us into a time where we can start to change our old ways of thinking, where our beliefs are exposed and we can ask questions about what we do, how we do things, and how we think. But what's sad is all I've been seeing is people and institutions simply just returning to the programs and practices that we were doing before, returning to the things that were familiar, not choosing to slow down and sit down and grieve with the tragedies that this moment brings, but just continuing to sustain the status quo. And the reality is, if we stay in this narrow-minded space, if we're not open to changing our paradigm, we might end up missing Jesus. And for me, it's sad to think that everything that I've built, the belief system, my way of thinking, it's scary to think that that might actually be fragile and that there might be something more. But God wants to rebuild. And when Jesus came back from the dead, nothing was the same. Do we expect when we come back for things to be the same? Because I don't. And I want to be ready and prepared for what's new. I think at the end of the day, we just have to be honest, be real, and ask ourselves, is it worth it to preserve what's familiar if it means we might miss Jesus?